Hello and welcome to part 8 of our do-it-yourself garden design video series. You know how this goes by now. We are showing you how to create your own custom landscape design one step at a time, and then eventually using all the resources on the Inland Valley Garden Planner to pull together your actual plant selections and do your custom landscape design layout. We have finally arrived at really getting down to the nitty-gritty in terms of things to think about related to garden design. And it's taken a while to get here, but hopefully you have much greater of an idea about where you want to go with your project by now and understand your site and some of the opportunities maybe and constraints from your site by doing your site assessment. So it all builds on itself one step at a time. And finally, with your goals in mind, with your site assessment done, we are going to get to the most fun part of it all, which is thinking about design with this video, Garden Design 1, Key Ideas for Residential Landscape Design. So this video is going to focus on design concepts. It's basically going to be your landscape design school crash course. And then after this video, we are going to examine all of the resources on the Inland Valley Garden Planner and then finally pull it together with some example designs where you can follow along step by step and see how that whole thought process comes together. And then eventually you'll be able to use all of that knowledge to create your great custom, perfectly suited for your landscape garden design. But before we get into lots of pretty example pictures looking at all of these garden design concepts, this is the part of the evening where we turn down the lights and slow it down some. Because right now, some of you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed. There is a lot of content that we have gone through. However, I want to reiterate that this leads up to a simple, logical, step-by-step system. And so here are some really important notes as you start thinking about all the different design elements to hopefully help keep you grounded and keep you from feeling overwhelmed. Remember that this is all going back to what your vision of a perfect garden or landscape is for you, or your first guess at that, and maybe it's going to evolve some over time, even after the garden is planted. Design is simply a tool to help you arrive at that vision created, built in the real world for you to enjoy. Design is a system, and I'm going to present it to you like a system. You don't need to be creative or a genius. If you want to be creative, if you want to be artistic, this is where you can funnel all of that great energy. But if you think of yourself as someone who's more of a linear thinker, if you don't think of yourself as a creative type, that is fine too. Because ultimately, design is about setting your goals, making a plan, then taking the steps to accomplish your goals. And here are a few notes to help you with landscape and garden design before we get to our design principles. Gardens are not furniture. So doing landscape or home garden design is different than if you are redesigning your living room. Garden design and gardens are not like purchasing a new couch, thinking hard about the style of the couch and the color of the fabric, and then after you get it, as long as your dog or cat doesn't shred it, it should be there in place, relatively unchanged for many years. Gardens are inherently different, and that makes them more interesting and exciting. But essentially, any landscape is a living system. It's something that's dynamic. It's something that's going to be growing over time. The relationships between the plants and the soil and water in the soil and the weather and the critters that come to your garden are going to change and evolve over time. And landscape design done well is a way to achieve a functional, maintainable living system that's a pleasure to be in, it's a pleasure to interact with, and it's going to be long-lived and will thrive as it grows in and provide all the things that you are hoping to get out of your landscape project. In this case, very different from your living room, you are the designer, but you're never fully in control. we are not totally in control of nature. And although we are not having a wild landscape, completely in our yard, it still is a little bit the wild world. Things grow. If you have a yard full of plants, even if you're doing everything right, every once in a while something is going to die. That's just kind of the process. And so if you become comfortable with the fact that even if you're new to landscaping, it's never going to be, quote, perfect. And in fact, there is no such thing as a perfect landscape. That's going to let you relax a little bit and have more fun as you go. Design is best as a bit of a continual process. So you're going to go through all of this work to have a great plan that's going to be your best chance of having this successful, thriving garden that is going to accomplish all of your goals. But over time, in any garden, there's going to be little tweaks that are going to be made. If you plant a whole garden full of plants, inevitably there's going to be one or two plants that just aren't going to thrive where you put them. And so you're not going to have to massively redesign everything, but it's going to be a chance to put your design eye back into these little improvements as you go. That's just the real world. And a lot of us have been conditioned as we see beautiful gardens in glossy magazines to think that a good garden should always be at the peak of bloom and at the peak of perfection, and every plant should look thriving and healthy. And one thing I'm going to tell you to hopefully relax you a little bit is that, yes, if we design our gardens well, if we do our site analysis well, select our plants well, overall, the garden should be very happy and healthy. But in every single garden, there's always a couple of plants that are maybe struggling. There's always a little bit of a down season. It's true that here in Southern California, if we do our research on our plants, we can have blooms year round. But our gardens, especially in hot inland Southern California, in the late summer, early fall, are not going to look as vibrant as they do in the spring. The reality is that in all of those beautiful magazines or online profile pictures of gardens, all of those gardens have one or two plants that are struggling. But the professional photographer just doesn't feature pictures of those plants. All of those gardens have a little bit of a down season some time of the year, but the professional photographer knows to go to the garden at the peak and take that picture. So you can still have a great garden that meets all of your goals and relax a little bit and not feel like you need to be a complete perfectionist. That's just the reality of working with your own garden or landscape. And so ultimately, I really encourage you to go into it with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to learn over time, and that understanding that no landscape is perfect and all landscapes evolve over time and experience disturbances. And that's going to help you make the whole process a lot less nerve-wracking and a lot more fun. It's one of the things I love about working with water-wise and native plants is the dynamic nature of the garden. It's not just mowing the lawn, trying to keep it perfectly green, and getting frustrated when there's brown spots. It's so much more fun and so much more interesting. And then another big idea is that make sure that you do your best to match your design with what is going to be maintainable for you. So think about how much time will really realistically be spent maintaining your garden. Are you going to do it yourself, or are you going to hire someone to do that for you? Are you going to be setting that person that you hire up for long-term success with your design, or are you going to be setting yourself up for long-term success with your design, keeping it maintainable? If you are someone who wants to have a lovely California native or water-wise garden, but you're not someone who wants to have gardening be your new big hobby, or you're not someone who really is in the position where you're thinking, I'm going to put in this garden and then I'm going to identify as a gardener. Most people I work with are not that person. Most people just want a nice, low-maintenance landscape that, yes, is colorful, yes, has a lovely space to gather, and hopefully and very often, wants some habitat for songbirds or butterflies or pollinators. You can have all of those things, but if you want to keep it low maintenance, I highly recommend that instead of falling in love with 72 different plants and putting in one of each and having your own little backyard botanical garden, keep it relatively simple. Consider groupings of no more than 10 or 20 different low maintenance plants. And what I mean by groupings is for smaller plants, for perennial plants, or small shrubs, instead of just having one, to make a bigger impact in the landscape while keeping the maintenance simple, having multiple of them properly spaced close to each other, maybe in groups of 3 or 5 or 7. It's said as a general kind of design default that when you are grouping plants, working with odd numbers rather than even numbers creates a more natural look. And I don't stick to that rigidly, but if it's your first time doing any landscape design, that's something that you might want to think about. And then for the larger plants, whether it's a medium-sized shrub or a large-sized shrub or a tree, you can use them individually or in multiples or repeated. The 10 to 20 number refers to the fact that most of the time when I do a front yard or a backyard landscape design for someone who is just wanting to have a nice garden, what I find is that when I add up the total number of different kinds of plants, so the total number of plant species, what I find is that often combined the different types of small perennial plants, the different types and sizes of shrubs, usually 1 to maybe 2 different species of trees, used as appropriate. Normally, I will have between 10 and 20 different types of plants, with 20 definitely on the high side, but oftentimes to fit all of the little niches, the sun, the shade, everything else that needs to happen, oftentimes between 10, 15, 18 different kinds of plants. And you could even have it be lower if you really choose your plants well and make sure you're selecting things that meet all of your needs. And then you could have a very simple landscape, maybe a couple of trees, some ornamental grasses, and a few shrubs. And it could be absolutely lovely. So don't go too crazy complicated with it if that's not your goal. And so here's an example of a relatively simple landscape that I absolutely love, with a big oak tree as a street tree, a small manzanita that's pruned to stay a little bit small as the one other plant along the parkway. And then on the main side of the landscape, what you can see is a little bit more of the same manzanita, a few succulents for accents, some rosemary, and a low ground cover, part shade in inland areas, loving ceanothus as the kind of knee-high, taking up space, larger ground covers, and then a small succulent bluefinger right along the pathway, so things aren't too large and overwhelming. So again, this falls, at least from this view, there's a few other different plants farther back, but again, this falls within that 10 to 20 number of different plants, especially from what we can see right here, and absolutely a lovely and quite low maintenance and very low water garden. Here's another example. This is a side yard along a sidewalk in a front yard landscape in Pomona. Actually happens to have some similar plants, just because these are some of the simplest, easiest to maintain kind of go-to plants in our area. But you can see to get a little bit more privacy for the house, and this is on actually a pretty busy corner, that same Howard McMinn manzanita. Here they let it get a little bit taller. A few California sages for some color. One large shrub kind of softening the corner and again providing a little bit more privacy, which is the toyon. Some succulent accents, and then again using more of that blue finger for just a very simple, reliable edging. And there's a couple of other plants that I didn't call out mixed in there for just some additional seasonal color and accents. And so don't feel intimidated. We have the resources that you need. So you very well may have spent some time on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website already before you started working your way through these videos. If you did, that's great. If not, we are going to go through all of the resources in depth in our next video. However, just to give you a preview, in case you're starting to feel pretty intimidated about some of the resources that we have for you. So if you are super into this and you're going to want to create your own completely custom plant palette for yourself, that is great. That's not what most people I work with are looking to do, however. They're looking for a little bit more guidance. And so we developed this whole garden design section of the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, where we have 8 main themes of gardens. You can see them all here. And for each of them, once you click on Exploring Design, you get quite a bit. You get coordinated plant lists, and each of these plant lists have at least one tree, a number of perennial plants, a number of shrubs, and so most of them are in that 10 to 20 different plants range. There's lots of other plants that could fit these themes that you could add in if you want to or do more research, but we wanted to keep it simple, really creating these themes as beautiful dynamic gardens that can be achieved without having to put 30, 40, 50 different kinds of plants, and just keeping it simple and easy to maintain. And so you get the plant list that will have the whole diversity of plants that you should need for your garden to create a great garden along that theme. And then we have example design plans for small, medium, large, extra large yards, and then a little lookbook where you can see pictures of some of these plants as well and other information. And then depending on how you click through this, and it's pretty intuitive, so the easiest thing is just to kind of click through it all and see how it's going to work. But there is a view where there are all of these what are called hotspots. And so you just hover your mouse over the little plant and it will automatically show the identification of that plant. You can click on it and you'll go to another web page where it has lots of detailed information about all of those plants, including things like how to maintain them over time. Most of them are easy to maintain, but you need to know when to do a little cleanup and what to do. And so we have all of that for you. Whether you have a small, medium, large, or extra large yard, you can have a landscape that meets any of these themes that you're interested in. And so these kind of semi-photorealistic perspectives give you an idea of what it'll look like. But then if you're going to want to take some of these planting ideas and actually recreate them for yourself, for each of these sizes, if you like any element or plant combination you see in this version of the view of the landscape, you can also get a bird's eye view drawn to scale landscape plan of that. If you want to, you can download it and print it out, and it's going to be at that 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot scale. So you can literally kind of remeasure and see how things are and adapt any of those elements to then creating your version of it over your base plan that you have already drawn to scale if you've been following along up to this point. And we're going to go through examples of that whole process, but if you're starting to feel intimidated, I wanted to give you a bit of a preview. If you are thinking, okay, I've sat through enough of this video content, I'm ready just to jump ahead to that point, then by all means, go ahead and do it. Or if you're really excited about it, you might do it now and come back to the rest of the videos later and then maybe do a second draft or an updated draft of your design plan after you go through the rest of the videos. So however it's going to work best for you, you can make that happen. But what we are going to do now in the rest of this video is talk about some of those nitty-gritty details of landscape design and of planting design. And if you are able to take what we talk about next, all of which are pretty simple, intuitive things once you hear those ideas, but a lot of people have just never thought about them, and then combine them with either these design themes and plans or your own custom plant palette selection if you're motivated to do that, you're really going to be set up well to be able to create that plan for a beautiful garden that is going to meet all of your goals, and you're going to be able to likely be very successful with it long term. We are going to move to a kind of mini encyclopedia, just going through one by one of some of the most important elements of residential landscape design. And again, none of these are rocket science. Most of them are pretty logical. But if you are exposed to all of these ideas, by the time you get to creating your own personal version of the landscape plan for your site, you're going to have a lot more tools to really set up a landscape that's going to look quite professional and going to meet the needs that you have in order to accomplish your goals. And so here we're going to work through those basic elements of landscape design, starting with landform. Landform basically refers to what the soil does, the elevations of the soil. Is your soil flat? Are there dips? Does the earth mound up in different areas? And most of the time when it comes to our front yard or backyard landscapes, we're thinking about landform in terms of drainage, in terms of terraces, maybe just in terms of what the soil is going to be doing in the heights and mounding or depressions in the soil. So oftentimes in projects like this, it's going to involve that rainfall capture, those spaces for water that we've talked about. This is an example of a picture from my backyard, actually, when we were just getting started working on our backyard space. And you can see a few things going on here. So when we moved into the property, it was just an even, gentle slope from the back of the house and then all the way down to the bottom of the backyard. But that didn't do a number of things that we wanted our backyard space to do. So you already heard me mention in previous videos when we talked about the site assessment how I had that drainage and flooding problem up against the front of the house. And when we work through the example design later on, you will get an insight into how I dealt with that. But part of the solution involved allowing water to naturally move around the front of the house through a dry stream bed and French drain system, and eventually in a large storm event work its way out to the side. And so what we did here, and it's just getting started, is we dug soil out, roughing in, coming along underneath the back gate that you can see, and through the landscape. You can just kind of subtly see it here because it doesn't have any rock in it yet, and it was still in the process of being dug. But we are starting to create a dry stream bed system, which you can see with that big piece of broken concrete there was the beginning of a bridge over that. And it had a couple of kind of pools within the bottom of that shallow, wide-ish dry stream bed that can fill in water. And then finally, if it needed to overflow, it can overflow down into this newly planted sunken meadow area. And that area was dug out quite a bit more as well. So it's the final lowest depression spot in the backyard where all the water naturally wants to end up in a large enough storm event to create runoff. And what we did with all of that extra soil is we used that to make other changes to the landform. So for example, you can see the broken concrete patio just on top of the terrace area, kind of in the middle ground right of the picture. And that is all broken concrete from part of the main solid concrete patio that we demolished, but that area was slanted. So we used some of that soil to even out that area. And then what we did is we used the rest of the soil to create this series of terraces, because again, it used to just be a gentle slope. And so we were able to fill some areas. We have some small level planting beds that can hold on to water a little bit better when it rained. And we were able to use extra broken concrete to build this sort of retaining wall and bench. And then on that upper terrace, that became a much better planting area. And there's actually some small tree and a number of shrubs in there, which you can barely see because they're quite young, and mostly what you see are some of the small annual wildflowers that we toss some seed out for to get some nice grow in and soil stabilization quickly. So that's just one example of how we use landform in order to better make what we had in the yard when we moved in better suit our goals for this backyard project. If you're interested in learning more about how this whole drainage system on this property was set up to turn all of that rainwater into a resource, you can check out on our YouTube channel our rainwater harvesting for home gardens workshop, where we go through a more extensive analysis of this property as just one of our many examples, showing how to pull all of those different parts of the system together, and many more steps of kind of construction and where eventually this design all went to. Another example of landform, which is a much smaller example and very common, is the dry stream bed that you see in this picture. And here you can see the low spot was created by digging out this dry stream bed, and then that extra soil is just mounded up right there on the right to create what's called a berm. And that mound does a few things in this picture. One, it creates a sense of interest in the landscape. It's not just a flat, typical like front lawn type landscape. But in addition to that sense of interest, those shrubs get elevated just a little bit higher up, so it provides a little bit more sense of privacy, a little bit more sense of being set apart from the street in this narrow side yard, which is quite nice as well. And then in addition to that, all of the plants in that mound will generally have increased drainage versus the landscape soil around it, because the root crown of those plants, the top of the roots, is going to be on that elevated area. So there will never be any standing water that's going to sit on those root crowns. So there are some plants that really like good drainage, and that is an extra way to provide what they like. And so you can see here with that, the low spot is created, the high spot is created, and then also, it's hard to see in the picture here, but on this property, there is just a subtle little slope from the base of the house down towards the street. And with that subtle slope, when the mounding up of the soil goes on the downslope side, that actually creates an increased pooling area and an increased capacity to hold onto water in that dry stream bed. Now, one thing to be careful of if you are doing that is make sure that that mound doesn't get so high that if there ever is a huge rain event, you don't want the foundation of the house to be potentially flooded. So make sure that the base of the house is always going to be at least a little bit higher than the top of that mound on the downhill side. But other than that, it's a really, really solid strategy for your water capture part. You just need to make sure of that one thing. And in this example, it was done successfully to where that mound provides that extra pooling capacity, but not so much that the water would ever back up against the house. And again, if you are interested in learning more about that, check out that rainwater harvesting for home gardens workshop recording, and we go very deep into understanding all of those aspects of how to set that system up, but make sure you are protecting the base of the house. Next thing we're going to talk about in basic elements of design are exposure and microclimates. Exposure just means sun and shade, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because we already went deeply into that. What does part sun and shade mean in terms of our site assessment drawing? And we already talked about microclimates already, those particularly hot or cold areas. So I'm just mentioning them here because that's part of your design toolkit, how you want to use those sunny areas, how you want to use those part shade areas or those morning sun but afternoon shade areas. Thinking about what you might want to do in those areas either as a people function or what plants you might want to put there as part of your design. And then also those microclimates as well. So here's just an example of some plants and a garden area that would be very appropriate in an inland area for that full blasting sun western facing area, especially if they're near paving or walls and have that extra hot microclimate. On the other side of things, here is the recirculating water feature in my backyard. We have a couple of small trees nearby. This area gets significant midday and complete afternoon shade, and this is a recirculating water feature, but we do need to top it off every once in a while, and then there's just a little bit of splash. It doesn't lose much water at all, but between the shade and just that slight splash that we are okay with just in this one little area, we have a cool microclimate that's just a little bit moister than other areas. And what we can see here on the ground, this is also the north side of that water feature. So between the plants and then being directly on the north side of this water feature, this is the shady, moist microclimate in our backyard. And we can very successfully grow a few California native plants that we quite like that would struggle in the drier, full sun areas that are predominantly the rest of the yard. So a shady, moist microclimate is also something very useful. Moving on from microclimates, we're going to be going through these things pretty quickly. We're going to start thinking about now some of the more visual aspects of working with landscape design and specifically planting design. And a really very useful one to have in your toolkit is to be thinking about repetition. One of the really common things that happens to a lot of first-time garden designers is everything is different all over the place in the landscape. And if you like an eclectic looking landscape, like this might be an example of one where there are individual, very interesting plants and colorful plants, that is great. But having one or two elements of repetition can kind of also help hold things together as an intentional landscape. Or if you like a more orderly look, then repetition is absolutely essential. And so one example of repetition here is with this bright yellow flowering sulfur buckwheat, where you can see this very naturalistic, kind of wild looking garden. But you have those three kind of dotting back and forth along the path, sulfur buckwheats, all in bloom at the same time. And that's a very intentional design element that kind of helps pull things together in this front yard and showing someone that might not know what's going on with the plants, yes, this is an intentionally designed space. Working with repetition as well also just helps pull the eye through, for example, if you had a wider garden, pull the eye through a wider space. I like, just for one example, in a lot of kind of medium-sized, for example, front yard style landscape, I will sometimes use deer grass. It's one of my favorite native bunch grasses as just an individual accent, but repeated here and there throughout the whole visual field of the garden. And that can pull together in some ways a more eclectic planting plan in the rest of the landscape design. So thinking about how you might want to use repeated plants. In general, at least one or two elements of repetition will help pull together the look and feel of a landscape. It's one of the easy ways to have what is a coherent looking landscape versus maybe a chaotic looking landscape. You will also notice that in the last slide, or the last image, it was credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And I mentioned this in one of our previous Setting Your Goals videos as well, but if you haven't seen that one, I want to make sure to mention it again. A number of the other images that we will see in this presentation are credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation's Native Plant Garden Tour. Theodore Payne Foundation is a nonprofit based in the San Fernando Valley, Sun Valley in Southern California, and they are dedicated to California native plants, their conservation and promotion of those native plants in the built landscape. So they do a lot of kind of programs and education working with urban horticulture and native plants. They also have an incredible native plant nursery that is open throughout the year if you go and visit them. However, the reason why we are showing them right now is because every spring they host an incredible native plant garden tour, which is in Southern California really the best way to see native and water-wise home gardens. A number of gardens open themselves up to be visited, and if you go on that tour, you can take pictures, find lots of inspiration, and also talk with a number of the homeowners, the landscapers involved in all aspects of the creation of those landscapes. And the landscapes range from do-it-yourself projects all the way through very high-end professional projects as well. So They have generously allowed me to use photography from their garden tour, a combination of pictures that I've taken and pictures that are their own photography as well. So definitely check them out. And one of the really cool things, if you're going to be searching for more inspiration or more example gardens for your landscape, is that if you go to the website that they have set up specifically for the Native Plant Garden Tour, nativeplantgardentour.org, you can actually access pictures of all of the properties on the tours for the last many years, all the way back to 2013. So definitely worth a look. So going forward through our kind of bag of tricks for planting design, massing is another one to consider. Massing just means working with a large number of the same plant repeated. Now, some plants work very well with massing, not all of them do. One example that works very well are the water-wise and native bunch grasses. So this is deer grass, which I had recently mentioned as something that I'll often use in a design as a repeated element. But this is a planting design that I did for a public garden that is a massing effect. So it's just the entrance, a lot of people walking in, and we wanted it to be lovely, but really here the idea is that people are going to be like walking in and continuing on to the main garden. And so here we had an existing tree, and we didn't want to compete with that, and you might have an existing tree at home as well. So what I did for the design is really just working with the deer grass spaced 4 to 5 feet apart to have a nice massing effect that you can see when it is in bloom. And deer grass happens to hold the old flower stems for a long time and doesn't need to be cut back more than every 2 or 3 years. And then you can't even see them right now, but just in between grasses, kind of skip a grass here or there and have some other accents, native sages and native buckwheats around. And then seasonally, you'll get a pop of color or flower from them, but really it's about a simple massing effect through here. This is something that would be very easy to do for either the back of a backyard, around the perimeter, for something that looks lovely, has great habitat value, and is also very easy to maintain, or it can even be the main idea with some additional trees and shrubs in a front yard. In addition to massing and repetition, also thinking about fun elements of surprise. So this is just one example of a Dudleya, California native succulent, that we worked into a rock and broken concrete little terrace wall in our backyard. And so surprise is just, maybe sometimes just a single different element. Could be a plant, could be a little piece of sculpture in the garden, could be a found object, just something to add visual interest. And now when we start to actually think about what plants to put next to each other, you have a few different ways to go. If this is all kind of getting overwhelming to you and you don't want to worry about this stuff, then don't worry about it. That's just fine. And in fact, we created those plant palettes along the different design themes on the garden design section of the website to have stuff that is going to give you great choices of things that will look good next to each other, as well as be compatible in terms of the conditions and the care that they need. But if you want to go a little bit deeper into it, here are some of the top ideas. Texture is about the effect that you get from the plant that has a lot to do with leaf shape, leaf size, and to some degree how the leaves are arranged on the plant. And so you can see a number of different textures here. You can see in the very foreground that kind of ferny leafed yarrow. You can see right behind it with the pink flowers, the larger triangular shaped hummingbird sage. And then you can see the grasses, the deer grass on the left and in the background, and then kind of the mid texture of the sage shrub on the right hand side. That's a Cleveland sage right there. And so lots of different textures. And textures are one of the things that can provide visual contrast. And so especially in the foreground with the ferny leaf yarrow, the large triangular shaped hummingbird sage, and then the narrow grasses, you get a lot of bold contrast by combining those very different textures. And one of the easy ways to kind of make a planting design pop is to contrast textures. So intentionally having the textures feel a little bit different, not too much of the same thing repeated over and over again with different plants, but some contrast between the textures. Here you could see getting even a little bit more subtle, really the focus on the texture of the grass. Here's alkali sacchaton. It's another California native grass, which I think is actually somewhat underused. It has this beautiful feathery grass part of the year. It does go dormant, need to get cut back in the winter, but then it comes back in the spring. And you can see that contrasted with the Margarita Bop penstemon with the purple flowers, and then the deer grass, which is a grass, but also has the very narrow flowers instead of the feathery flowers, and then the redbud shrub in the far back. So again, lots of texture contrast. And so even though the plants themselves outside of the flowers might not have a lot of color contrast in this picture, the texture contrast really does a lot of that planting design work. But speaking of color, color is also something that you might want to think about. And when we're working with our California native and water-wise plants, actually the leaf color is really a more important tool to work with for contrast or to get your visual impact than the flower color. If you want to get really into flower color, you definitely can. But the thing about flowers is that they're not there year-round on the vast, vast majority of plants. However, the leaf color, and with our water-wise and California native plants, we have so many different colors of leaves, from silver to dark deep green to a lighter greens, to yellow greens, that we have so many different leaf colors we can work with, and those combinations are going to be happening every day of the year. So my personal philosophy when I'm working with color is that I like to work with a nice diversity of plants, and I'll mostly be selecting plants for their habitat value, their size, their shape, the other things they're going to do. I'll think about leaf color, and I just let the flower colors work themselves out. And because I'm working with a nice diversity of plants, the flower colors, in my opinion, usually end up looking quite beautiful, and I don't need to think about that as an extra element. Now, if you're someone who knows you want orange and yellow flowers, if that's what's going to help you meet your goals, then you can go for it. But there's so many other great qualities of plants that I feel like when I'm just thinking about flower color or really selecting plants for flower color, I'm sometimes missing some of the more important reasons to put a plant in my landscape or not put a plant in my landscape. And even within flower color, there's so many different subtleties of color that this is an example from my front yard where we ended up with two purple flowering plants right next to each other, flowering at the same time, but you still see a depth of difference within those purple flowers. So to me, that's just fine. I'm not worried about, there's too many purple things next to each other. However, if it ended up being next to a bright orange flower, there'd be contrast, and that'd be great as well. So only worry about flower color if you want to. I think much more about trying to balance out flower season and making sure that I have plants as close to blooming year-round as possible in my landscape. And we provide you guides to those bloom seasons within the documentation for each of those plant themes on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And if you want to add in other plants as well, for all of the plants that we have profiles of the Garden Planner, all 350-ish plants, we tell you when the bloom season is for those as well in a typical Southern California garden. So that's really in terms of the actual plant next to a plant. How is it going to look good? Those are some of the big ideas. The texture, kind of the color. You'll think about size. We'll talk, especially as we get into the going through the landscape design example, how to think a little bit about layering, foreground, middle ground, background. But those are some of the large ideas. Again, it's not rocket science. It's all pretty logical, just kind of laying it out so you have those in your toolkit to think about. Now, in terms of keeping your plants healthy over time, an important concept that is really important to think about is grouping plants with similar moisture needs, grouping plants with basically similar irrigation or watering needs together so that you can provide them all the right amount of water that they need. The fancy word for that is hydrozones. So if you see that written somewhere else, a hydrozone is a grouping of plants in the landscape together that all want the same amount and frequency of irrigation. And so I think this picture is a good example of the hydrozoning concept. you can see in the foreground here, there's a variety of native and water-wise plants that are all low-water plants. And in the background, right behind the patio, there's a big hydrangea and a Japanese maple. Those are high-water plants. And those are in the back corner together appropriately in a small area. They probably really like those plants, but they could easily be irrigated along their high water needs together. If those two plants were randomly spaced in the middle of this foreground landscape, either everything would be overwatered to make those two high water use plants happy, or those two plants would always be miserable because the rest of the landscape was being watered as a low water landscape and they would never be happy. So make sure that you set up your hydrozones appropriately. And that's also going to connect with how your irrigation system is set up. If you're working with drip irrigation, you have a little bit more leeway of how exactly, which area of the one valve of drip irrigation can water an area more, one valve can water less. You can do the same thing with sprinklers as well, but sprinklers generally follow kind of regular patterns of square or rectangular-ish sections of the landscape. And so really the important concept is to make sure you're thinking about it. And as you are selecting plants for one area of the landscape, most of the time what you're going to want to do is select all low water use plants or all medium water use plants. Or if it's a fruit tree section of your garden, then that might be also the place where if you have a couple of other plants that either want high water use or can tolerate high water use, they will go there. So that's the hydrozoning concept. And you can get a little bit flexible with it. So here's an example of a front yard, mostly California native and a few Mediterranean climate plants. Some of them had recently been renovated in this picture, so there's a mixture of more mature plants and younger plants. But you can see here there's also a few fruit trees mixed in. So there's a dwarf citrus tree on the left. There's actually one that's kind of hard to see in the middle, and this pomegranate tree on the right. And so even though those are amongst the lower side of the water users for fruit trees, they are all solidly kind of upper medium water use to lower end of high water use plants if you want to actually get good production and good quality fruit. They might live after they're established with getting far less water, but if you want consistent good quality fruit, they're going to need more water than the native and Mediterranean climate plants in the rest of the landscape. And so even though they seamlessly look like they're integrated into the landscape, the way that was accomplished is there's a primary drip irrigation system buried underneath the mulch for the landscape overall. And then just in the root zone of those fruit trees, there's a second valve that gives the additional supplemental water that those fruit trees need to be watered a little bit more often and a little bit deeper. And so that's a way to think about hydrozoning, still give everything the amount of water that it wants, but making sure we are watering plants appropriately. Here's another example of that concept. We have a California native carex meadow in the main center of this garden. And that's, as a turf alternative, much lower water than traditional fescue type turf. However, it still is going to need more water than some of the California native and water-wise plants that surround it. And so if it is properly set up, there's going to be one, quote, hydrozone that's going to provide the higher level of water use or the higher level of water need for the center meadow area on the irrigation system. And then the drier surround could have a different irrigation valve that's going to water all of that on the lower water hydrozone. Next, as we go through our sort of encyclopedia of landscape design things to be thinking about, I want to share some thoughts on plant density, meaning how close together the plants are versus how much open space is in between each plant. Something that a lot of first-time gardeners who are thinking about doing their first garden design that I work with are intimidated about is having too much plant cover. For some reason, the default these days is to, for some people, is to kind of think that they're going to have this big mulched area and then kind of one plant here, one plant there, one plant here, one plant there, and a lot of space in between each plant. If for some reason that's really what you know you want, I am not telling you you can't have that. However, in the vast majority of cases, as a default, our landscapes will look better and also perform better if there is not a lot of open space in between each plant. And so doing that detailed planting design for your specific yard, it's going to be a process most of the time of looking up the full mature width of the plant and spacing that plant appropriately so it can grow to that full size, but there's not going to be a lot of open space after that. It's going to grow to its full size, and there's going to be another plant that's going to grow to its full size, and those plants will basically nicely come together. We don't want to crowd them too much to where they're going to be competing with each other, and we're going to have to be cutting them back a lot. But we're going to want to let them grow nicely together, unless there's a specific reason to keep things more open. So I thought that this is a nice picture that kind of shows some of those elements. Working on the right-hand side with a combination of trees, some shrubs in the background, some nice layering. So in the background, we have more height, and then we have some shrubs, and then we have our more ground cover layer in the front. Working with that blue finger succulent that I mentioned right on the right side of the walkway already. And then farther to the right, that is pigeon point coyote brush. It's a very tough, very reliable California native plant. That's a low shrub. It might get a little bit taller over time. Generally maxes out at like knee high, but can be trimmed to stay even lower than that if it's wanted to, and grows in and provides a nice even ground cover. And it looks much nicer, the overall effect, than if you're seeing a lot of just open mulch all over the place. Open mulch also over time becomes a place where weeds can grow. But if the plants are otherwise occupying that space, you're less likely to have issues with continued pressure and needing a lot of maintenance in terms of weeding. Now, there's some areas where you might want more open space. So I think this landscape does that pretty nicely. Here you can see the parkway area, sometimes called the parking strip, in between the curb and the sidewalk. Once lawns are coming out and being replaced by planted landscapes, those areas require a good bit of thought, because if you're on a street where cars are going to be parking along the curb, then those landscapes are going to need to accommodate car doors opening. And if there's people that are going to need to either walk along or across those little planting strips or parking strip landscapes, that needs to be accommodated as well. So this landscape is actually on a decently busy corner, and so there probably is a lot of that. And so you can see in the main front yard landscape, there is that higher level of plant density, but along the parking strip, they're working with a decomposed granite mulch, some little cobblestones and boulders for interest, and then a little bit less of a plant density, kind of just sporadically planted, so that there is room for car doors to open and people to walk through as needed. I think that's a really lovely strategy. And if you followed this curve around the park strip on the other side, where it's more of a side street, the planting density is a little bit higher than that, but it's still the decomposed granite, succulents, and a few other small shrubs included. Here are some other kind of thoughts related to plant density. So on the left-hand side, this is actually another angle around the corner of this same front yard landscape from the previous image. And so you can see how they're working with plant density and layering. Again, tree in the back from this view, and then mid-sized shrubs, and then working with simple ground cover, succulent as an accent, and then cobblestones as boulders. So it's a very relaxed, very low maintenance, very simple, but very nice looking, very low water landscape. And on the right here, there's a picture of another landscape, and showing, I think, a nice balance. This one has a little bit more height, a little bit more plant density. There's that nice gravel path that you could see kind of going through the middle, allowing people to walk through. And then also when the garden care needs to be done, it could be easily accessed through the path that goes through those more dense planting beds, working with some rock and boulders as well to kind of bring it all together. So I think that's quite lovely. This is another higher density landscape, working with some small shrubs, some ornamental grasses, some perennials, and even some bulbs, some Mediterranean native bearded irises, and then some California poppies as wildflowers to fill in the open space while the other plants are growing in and for some seasonal interest. But in a landscape like this, especially where there's so many other lawns in the neighborhood, oftentimes lawns are Bermuda grass in Southern California, and sometimes that Bermuda grass might go to seed. If this was a lot of open mulch, it'd probably be much more continual maintenance than with this space being occupied by plants. And it looks quite nice as well. If you're interested in a slightly lower density landscape, you might take a look at this picture. And I will say in this picture that some of these plants are small and will grow in more over time. But in terms of a balanced look, if you do want a little bit more open space, to some people those very dense landscapes do just look like too much. You might take inspiration from this picture. This is a landscape that was designed by Tim Becker, who's the director of horticulture at the Theodore Payne Foundation. And I really like the balance that's achieved in this landscape where, yes, there's some areas where there's a little bit more mulch and a little bit more open space, but there's this beautiful layer of small trees in the background. Some of these trees will grow in some more. And then there's areas where there's shrubs. And then in the areas where the plants are lower, it's more small grasses and perennials. There's a really nice mix of cobblestone and small boulders and even some sticks and other natural elements. And so it doesn't just feel like spotted plants in a sea of mulch. It creates a very coherent look. He also has the decomposed granite walkways accessing other parts of the yard. And so it creates this really nice dynamic sense in the garden and the sense of balance, even though there's a little bit more space between the shrubs. Here's another picture of that same landscape. And so you can see this kind of diagonal of, at least as of right now, a little bit more open space, but just looks so natural and wonderful. And if you want a little bit lower of a plant density, especially on the ground level, one of the ways to successfully achieve that from a design sense is by making sure that you have enough verticality in the landscape. So trees and large shrubs. And once those trees are grown in and provide shade, that can also help with some of the problems of there being a lot of weeds if there's just too much open area. Some weeds will come up in the shade, but you get the most weed pressure in full sun areas, definitely. And so here's a kind of more extreme example of that. This is a front yard landscape where you can see all of the area that's pretty much just open mulch. However, when you are walking down this street in Pomona, when you come across this landscape, especially on a hot day, it's actually lovely to come upon. These are two behind the benches pineapple guava trees. They are a low water, a South American tree actually, but a quite low water plant and very ornamental. They take a while to grow up to be that size, but they will get there and even taller over time. So those are pruned up into small multi-trunk trees. There are street trees, happen to be crepe myrtles here, as well as I think we're just getting the last branch of an oak tree that's farther out. And so with that shade, with these nicely placed benches, the broken concrete little kind of mini patio areas with the benches, and then the ring of cobblestone and rock around the edge, and just the scattered kind of succulents around as well, and small shrubs. It really works to have this open space. It's just kind of a sense of calm. But if those trees weren't there, it would just feel open and kind of unplanted. So if that more open space does appeal to you, think about those trees and those vertical elements being really important. And that makes sense, because if we think about walking through a nice natural landscape, if you're walking through a kind of heavily treed area, a more forested area, not in every ecosystem, but in a lot of ecosystems, the plants tend to be a little bit more scattered here and there. But if we are walking in an open area where it's full sun, unless it's a desert, the planting density tends to be much higher. So that's a way to kind of have lower planting density and still have a natural look. And so that's going to segue into us reflecting on the importance of trees. trees are not something to be afraid of. Trees are essential to a nice lifestyle and comfortable living in hot inland Southern California. A lot of people who I work with are afraid of trees because all they know about growing trees in their landscape sometimes is that trees could potentially cause damage to sewer lines. And then from that, they're worried about irrigation and all sorts of other things. Or trees might lift the sidewalk or lift concrete. So that, in most cases, is generally not the tree's fault. And especially if you're working with some of our medium-sized or smaller trees, generally not a concern anyways. So let's start with the idea about sewer lines. The reality is, if you have an old cracked sewer line that is leaking, any plant will send its roots into that sewer line because plant roots follow where they find moisture. If, however, your sewer line has been replaced, and in a lot of our service area, there's a lot of kind of 1940s, 1950s houses where the sewer lines have now had to have been replaced or will get there soon. If it's been replaced by a modern plastic line that's not going to be leaking, then you're not going to have to worry about roots going into the sewer line. You might not plant your huge oak tree directly right on top of it, but in general, you can plant trees in your landscape and be just fine. You don't want to plant big trees right next to the foundation of your house. Sometimes we see people do that, and that's not good as well. But think medium-sized trees, at least 5 feet away from the base of the house. But also remember to think about the width of the tree canopy. And if you do want the upper branches to be over the top of your house, you might, because you might want the shade. Or if you don't, think about all those things. And for larger trees, generally at least 10 feet away from the base of the house. And again, think about the canopy and how you might want that all to grow together in the future. So that's thinking about sewer lines. Thinking about lifting paving and sidewalks. Again, if you're planting a huge tree, you don't want to put it right up against the edge of the sidewalk. Just think about, for example, an oak tree. Oak trees are great. I like to encourage people to plant oak trees. But one day over time, might not be for 50 years, that tree is going to be a few feet in diameter. So you don't want to plant it just 1 foot off the sidewalk. And most of the time, I recommend people would plant an oak tree 5 to 6 feet minimum off of like a sidewalk or main paving edge. But smaller trees like this Catalina Island cherry here can actually be pretty close. And then in terms of the roots actually lifting things, the main problem that most species of trees have with roots lifting pavement is most often when those trees have been growing either in lawn or in an area that's been watered, like a lawn often gets watered. And so how does a lawn get watered? A lawn gets watered in the summer in an inland area of Southern California. Oftentimes, if there's not watering restrictions, 3 to maybe even 4 times a week. And very shallow because the roots of the lawn don't get very deep. 3, maybe 4 inches, ideally 4 inches, but still quite shallow. Most large trees want to have their roots, a lot of their kind of feeder roots are going to be at least a foot deep, if not 2 feet and even deeper. And so what happens when those large trees are only getting watered like a lawn is getting watered? All of their roots are going to be trying to be where the moisture is, which is right at the surface. And as those roots get larger, it's not surprising that problems ensue. So if you are planting a water-wise landscape, and if after that first year of establishment, you are watering your plants how they want to be watered, which is infrequent, deep irrigation, you're going to be training the roots on your water-wise trees to grow like they want to, which is going to be deep to make the most use of that infrequent periodic irrigation and those winter rains. And so you won't have the same problems with surface roots. So those are just some things to consider to get over any potential fears of trees, because trees equal shade, and outdoors in Southern California, it seems to be getting hotter and hotter more consistently in the summer, but even in a not particularly hot summer, it's still hot a lot of the summer. And if you want to be using your space throughout the hot time of the year, then overhead shade if possible, or minimally afternoon shade to your patio spaces and the spaces where you want to be is essential. And so in this example, the Catalina Island cherry, which is a relatively narrow but pretty tall, fast-growing native tree, is a great choice near a patio space. Also a large manzanita shrub that's almost reached the proportion of a small tree here. And then you can see just the branches of a sycamore tree off the right, all providing nice kind of dappled shade at different times of the day to this patio space. Thinking about the effect of walking along the property on the street, I really love this row of native redbud shrubs kind of pruned up to small trees. And you can see, we talked about landform earlier. There must have been some project going on at the house where there was some extra soil and they kind of built up and made this little berm along here. And I visited on a pretty warm day, and the shade through this area was just lovely. It created its own little cooler microclimate, and that might be something that you want in your front yard or backyard or side yard or along the street. Also, just thinking about visually trees. This is a front yard landscape that I photographed in Claremont, Southern California, and I really like the simple plant palette. We have pigeon point coyote brush, which I mentioned earlier in that other front yard. We have Santa Cruz Island buckwheat here as this flowering shrub, the smaller flowering shrub, and you can see how it's repeated throughout the landscape. So that's going back to our repetition idea. In the back, you have a native sage plant. This is going to be something like Allen Chickering sage or Pozo blue sage. Great smelling, beautiful purple flowers when it's in bloom. And here you can see they decided to go with a little bit of a lower planting density, a little bit more open space. Probably met their goals just fine. I like how they mixed in some of that rock and boulder. And then this tree, which really makes the kind of statement in the landscape, provides the sense of depth and layering. So think about this landscape without this tree. Everything would be kind of pretty evenly middle-sized, some stuff a little lower, some stuff a little higher, but not a whole lot of visual interest, especially in the time of year where there's not a lot of bloom. But this tree really provides more of a sense of depth and layering. It definitely provides shade to the house and a little bit more sense of privacy to the window behind this tree. The Catalpa tree provides beautiful blooms during part of the year, and altogether just makes a much more lovely experience of this front yard. And this tree will get a little bit bigger, but also cool this part of the house on a hot day. It's not going to have as much direct sunlight on it. The tree is going to actually shade the house from the sun angle. There's no place that you'd rather be outdoors during the summer in inland Southern California than underneath the shade of a coast live oak tree. That's the perspective from which I took this picture, looking out at one of the houses on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And I can tell you the difference that it feels to be in full sun on a hot day versus underneath an oak tree is so real in inland Southern California. If you want to test that out for yourself, you can come visit us at our Waterwise Community Center demonstration garden here in Montclair, and you can stand in the full sun areas of the garden and underneath the oak tree canopies, and it is just so noticeable. If you have room to plant an oak tree, go for it. There's so many benefits to having a large shade tree, and it's going to take a long time till that oak tree reaches its maximum size. If you plant an oak tree, you're not going to be around for that. It's a long-term investment, but after 10, 12 years, you will actually have some shade canopy if it's growing well. We have mature looking oak trees here on our property, which one of the people who works here, who's been here for 22 years, has planted, and they are quite lovely and provide a lot of shade. So you can get there. And even after just a few years, if it's growing well, you're going to have a nice small tree. So an oak tree can definitely be worth the investment. And oak trees provide so much habitat value. If you're thinking about smaller trees and wanting some dappled shade, here's a picture of the Desert Museum Palo Verde tree in a courtyard area at the California Botanic Garden. absolutely lovely. And Palo Verde trees grow quite quickly as well. So it's a great if you just want one or two mid-sized trees, or even put a few of them for a real statement in a single landscape. And then here we looked at this picture already when we were talking about hydrozoning, but this part of the garage and then attached to the house faces due west in inland Southern California, would be blasting sun onto this garage if it wasn't for these couple of trees, which do make a difference. The trees will take the sun and be okay with it, and the structure doesn't need to take as much sun. Another picture of patio area underneath an oak tree. An investment in trees is definitely something to make. And I mean, it is real. So right around us, we have some neighborhoods where we have very few street trees and some neighborhoods where there is a lot of street tree canopy. And on the same day, I have gone from one neighborhood to the next, and you can really feel the difference. I mean, I feel like it must be at least 10 degrees on some days, where otherwise the weather and the feeling would be exactly the same. So think about trees, making that investment in your landscape. There might be maintenance. Trees do require pruning every once in a while in most cases, but they don't need to be hacked back every year if they're pruned well. Only every number of years might you need to do some pruning, and you absolutely will reap the benefits of having trees in so many ways. And trees are important to more than just us humans. So I have a smallish oak tree in my backyard, but even in its smallish state, it's reached maybe now, I'd say about 20 feet wide. And the shade underneath it on a hot day, it creates its own microclimate in the backyard. And here are just a few pictures of some of the many birds that make a home during different parts of the day in the oak tree. We've also had nests in the tree. We have goldfinches, we have hummingbirds, we have mockingbirds, and so many other different bird species spend so much time in this oak tree. Oak trees are so important to butterflies and to birds and some of the other small insects that we will never notice but are important bird food, some of the other caterpillars for other kinds of moths that we will never see and notice but are important bird food, that oak trees are considered to be an ecological hub. So if you're interested in supporting that beneficial wildlife in your garden and you have room for an oak tree, that is the most valuable tree you can plant. And remember that trees take time. So plant them now so that you have the trees and shade in the future. And additionally, something that's going to seem very obvious when I say it, but I have seen even landscape professionals make this mistake. When you are working on drawing out your planting plan, once we get to the next stage, remember that if you draw your oak tree or even your small tree at its mature size, when you're looking at your drawing, sometimes people think, okay, that's my tree. Everything underneath that is going to be part shade or shade, and then they start thinking about shade plants. That might be true one day, but for many years after you plant your tree, it is still going to be full sun. So remember that you're going to want to have full sun plantings under and around your newly planted tree. Now, if it's a fast-growing tree, you might select plants that can tolerate either full sun or partial shade, so you know they're going to live through that transition. But if it's an oak tree, you're going to have many years till you're getting any significant shade, because even when it starts to have a bit of a canopy, there's going to be sun angles in the morning and the afternoon that are still going to penetrate into it. So you're going to be okay for quite a while with selecting smaller full sun plants. Just make sure that the plants you select to go right next to your trees are going to be plants that are going to stay on the smaller side. I think the designer or owner of this garden, when they were selecting the plants, did a really good job with some wildflowers and some of the top smaller native perennials for Southern California. And so they're never going to compete with that tree growing in, and you can still visually see the nice separation between the lower plant layer and then the tree. Next concept that we're going to cover is one that for people who like a little bit wilder of a garden aesthetic or a more naturalistic approach can be very useful, especially in front yard garden spaces. in terms of having the garden be able to have everything that's lovely about having a naturalistic garden, but not feel too wild, especially if you're maybe having the first naturalistic garden in your neighborhood. And that's a concept called cues to care. Cues to care was developed by an academic named Joan Nassauer. She was a professor, and what she studied was landscape psychology, which is a very specific field. But what she was interested in overall was, why do people think what they do about landscapes? And she was very interested in front yard native and naturalistic landscapes. She was working in a different state where the natural landscape type was different than where we are. It was grassland meadows. And in her area, people started installing these kind of restoration style grassland meadows and letting the grass get tall and be a bit wild. And some people thought they were lovely and looked great, and some people thought it looked like those landscapes were abandoned and were very upset about them. And so she started doing all of these studies, and she did all of these visual simulations where she would have the same landscape and it would just have one or two things different. And she studied people's reactions. And what she found out was not that surprising, but very relevant when we think about it in a very purposeful way for our landscapes. People generally will like, or even if they don't know what's going on with the landscape, accept landscapes in their neighborhoods when they understand them to be things that are intentional and cared for, even if they have no idea what's going on with the plants. And they tend to not like landscapes that they see when they think that they are neglected and not cared for. And so if we are going to have a wilder style of planting, which is right in line with my personal aesthetic, I love to have a kind of a wilder looking landscape. I think it's personally one of the more beautiful approaches to landscaping, and it maximizes those habitat benefits. But if we're going to do that in our front yards, we can go a long way towards having the neighbors think the landscape also looks good, or having the homeowners association not have any issues with it, if we include some of these features that show that these are intentional, cared for landscapes, these cues to care. And so what does that mean for our Southern California kind of native and water-wise landscapes if we want to make them look more naturalistic? I really like this front yard landscape example. From the outside, there's a lot of pretty much medium-sized native shrubs. And so think about how this landscape would look if this split rail fence and these little piles of rocks periodically here and there throughout the landscape weren't there. Then it would look really overgrown and would be a landscape that I would understand if some of the neighbors are thinking, was this intentional, or is this just kind of overgrown stuff that happened to be there? But if you then think about it in context of that nicely kind of set up and well maintained, there's not like old broken fence posts or anything, those little piles of rocks that go along with the aesthetic. And then when you look directly down the path, you see this nice decomposed granite path. It's not overgrown. The shrubs are trimmed to be at the edge of the path. And then you look farther in and you see this nice flagstone that's built up to make this kind of split level, slightly raised area on the right where there's other plantings, and then all the way to near the front yard where there's this patio space looking back out. You notice that, yes, even though the plantings are on the wild side, this is clearly a very intentional, very cared for space that is well loved. And so that kind of really embraces that whole cues to care concept, where you can see that this is a very intentional landscape. And what we see in the real world is that when these wilder planted landscapes include these clearly intentional, clearly well-built elements, that the neighborhood is much more likely to think that the landscape really adds benefit to the neighborhood, and that there aren't kind of concerns about an abandoned kind of front yard. And with this, we've concluded our exploration of the typically most important factors of landscape design for a residential front yard or backyard. And we are going to transition to thinking about the different types of spaces you're likely to have in your landscape where you can apply all of this stuff that we've just talked about. Some of these are going to overlap with some of the items that we talked about during the setting your goals videos. So if you haven't seen those for some reason, I would highly recommend going back and starting with those before proceeding. And so here we go. We're not going to talk much about people spaces because we talked a lot in those setting your goals videos about different people spaces, option for patios, and materials. But I just wanted to mention that because what you're going to start thinking about now as you are going to be getting into your design is the interplay between the different types of spaces. So you're going to think about siting your patio space or your space for your bench or your couple of chairs if you are going to be including these spaces to lounge or relax in or socialize in. And now you're also going to be thinking about how you want to surround them with plants, or certainly if it's a full sun area, how you want to shelter them with plants during different times of the day. We've talked about all of that. But also, now it's the time to start talking about connection spaces, the paths and the access from your house to your driveway maybe, to the different people spaces in your front yard or your backyard, or how you're going to get through the planted areas of your landscape as you might want to spend some time among your plants. You might want to observe what's going on with the birds or the pollinators, or you or a landscaper that you're working with are going to need to get in periodically to do some care of the plants around there. One of the most important things to remember is that plants are going to grow, so make sure you give yourself enough room. One of the most common mistakes that I see in landscape design is that shrubs that are going to get quite wide eventually are planted just too close to the edge of pathways that are supposed to be open over time, or to the edge of driveways or sidewalks. And it's hard to anticipate that without really thinking through the design process or the planting design process, looking up how plants are going to grow over time. It's really easy to take a look at a plant in a 1-gallon pot and think you could put it relatively close to the edge of a path. If your plant is going to get 6 feet over time, I advise you to put it a little bit more than 3 feet away from the edge of the path, even if you're wanting that plant to be right along the edge of the path. Normally what I'll do is for plants that are going to get wide, 5 feet, 6 feet, or more over time, is I will put them even farther back in the landscape and anticipate leaving at least 1, more often 2 feet between the edge of the path and the edge of where I think that shrub is going to grow to one day. And then closer along the path, as long as there's room to fit everything in the landscape, I'll work with smaller plants or wildflowers, perennials, things that are going to be a little bit more reliable in terms of their width. Some of those large shrubs, there's just a range, and sometimes those large shrubs grow even larger than they're anticipated to be, especially with our inland heat in Southern California. And so by having that shrub a little bit farther back, and then the smaller plants or perennials that are a little bit more predictable in terms of their width and a little bit easier to cut back and keep looking good if they do want to get a little too large, we create a nice layering effect, and we also keep our paths more likely to be clear. Another thing to think about in terms of giving yourself enough room is making sure your pathways and your access spaces are wide enough from the beginning. And in a few slides, we're going to talk a little bit about recommendations for how wide your paths can be. But I really like the picture right here as an example of a common technique that works out very well, which is making sure the width of your paths are pretty generous. This is probably a 4-foot wide path, if you have room to, especially if you're going to have shrubs planted on one or both sides of your path. And that way, when the shrubs inevitably grow a little bit over the edge of the pathway, there's still plenty of room to walk by. And in fact, this ends up often being a very nice naturalistic look. But if you started with just like a 2-foot path, which at the time of planting might be plenty comfortable to walk up and down and through your garden, and then all of a sudden a few years later on, the shrubs are growing over the edge of that 2-foot path, all of a sudden you have an impassable space. So sometimes giving yourself a little extra space in the pathway planning really works well long term. And then remember, wherever you can, use permeable surfaces like broken concrete, gravel, decomposed granite, or sandset pavers, or sometimes people will do broken concrete or pavers or flagstone in a small pea gravel. And then as you think about how your paths are going to lead, think about what you want to accomplish with that design. So if you want a formal or a modern element to your garden, then having straight pathways that meet at regular right angles might be a way to go. And sometimes having very straight linear pathways and then letting your planting be kind of wild and very naturalistic is a nice way to kind of balance that intentional kind of modern look with the relaxed naturalistic planting. Or if you just want a very natural and informal feeling, relaxed space, think about gentle curves to your pathways. And one of the nice things about gently curving pathways is that as someone's walking along it, naturally your eye is going to be moving as you slowly go from one direction to another along the curve. Whereas with a straight path, you're more going to be looking at a focal point down at the end of the path. And so either of those you can plant accordingly. Do you want one really beautiful, long flowering at different times of the year accent shrub or even a tree down at the focal point at the end of a long straight path? Or are you going to think about a curving path where your eye is going to be brought to different focal points as you walk along it? If you are going to be laying out a curved path, one tip as you are actually going to be moving into construction of that path or laying it out on the site is leave a garden hose out in the sun for a couple of hours so it gets nice and flexible. And then you can use that to really figure out exactly the curve you want of your path, and then use flags or flower or stakes to kind of trace that once you have that set. If you're interested in learning more about those tips and techniques as you go from design to actually building it, be sure to check out our Installation Establishment of California Native and Waterwise Gardens online workshop recording on our YouTube page. Oh, here's an example of a smaller, more intimate garden that has a nice gravel pathway. And it looks to me like they kind of did the same thing, just on a smaller scale, where the pathway was probably planned to be a little bit larger, and then the shrubs grew in eventually, and really still leaving enough space to pass through. This is a much smaller garden space, and so it works for the path to become more intimate, but there's still a good couple of feet throughout most of it, and the shrubs have enough room to grow but can be trimmed or pruned to keep that accessible. And so it creates a very nice intimate space for one or two people just to walk through and enjoy the garden. And so you can see here, if you do want to work with larger shrubs, it will require a little bit more pruning over time, probably, and shaping, but it can create this very nice intimate space that really feels like a kind of nice secluded getaway, even if you're on a pretty busy street, for example, in this front yard. Thinking about materials, you have a lot of different ways you can go. So this is just an example of a larger gravel. This is probably about a 3/4 inch granite or river rock gravel, where here's an example of another gravel pathway with pea gravel, which kind of forms a little bit more of a crunch underneath the foot. Neither one is better or worse. It's just all about what's going to work for you. And if you really want to be ambitious, you could even think about how to creatively reuse driveway spaces. Now, this is a larger project, larger budget, but can create a really nice effect. So in this landscape, the driveway was redone and largely became gravel. Usually when that's done, there's a structurally supportive grid underneath. Usually it's a plastic material. If you're interested in looking into it, a common one that's used these days is a product called Gravel Pave, which then gets filled and covered with gravel so you don't see it. But a nice effect with a gravel either walkway or driveway like that is not only is it completely permeable, but then that can also sweep and just become the mulch in the plantings nearby, if they are plantings that are well adapted to having that gravel mulch. So here's some recommendations for pathway widths. Most often, if you just want a general kind of starting place for a residential yard, I will recommend a 3-foot wide path that's very comfortable to walk on, easy for access, and if your plants are happy and grow just a little bit more over the edge of the path, you still have some room to work with. If you are going to be doing something firm, like either true pavement or decomposed granite, where you're hoping to be able to get a wheelchair on it eventually, 3 feet wide is a minimum for a wheelchair to be able to fit on a path. And wheelchairs will not work well at all in gravel pathways or mulch pathways. So that's something to think about. So most often as a default, 3 feet. If you anticipate you're going to be working with a lot of larger shrubs and you want them to have room to grow over the edges and have that fully naturalistic look, it's very well considering going with a 4-foot wide path, which is going to look really large in most yards at the beginning. But if you're planning for things to grow in over the edge, that is something definitely to consider. 2-foot wide path is workable for occasional paths, and it's plenty comfortable to walk down. If you're thinking that you're going to need to be working with a wheelbarrow or something like that through different parts of the garden, definitely go with a larger than 2-foot path, 3-foot path. But 2-foot is workable for occasional footpaths, but leaves little margin for plants to overgrow into the pathway. Those paths can disappear quite quickly and become impassable. So make sure you're going to be able to maintain that 2-foot wide pathway with the plants nearby. And then also something that could work well is just into a mulched garden of whatever mulch type you have, whether it's wood chips or decomposed granite or gravel, just having a few stepping stones into that to create that pathway that's a little bit easier to access and leads the eye through, making it known that that's the pathway, or even just having it be the gap in between plants in the mulch. So in my backyard, most of our pathways are just wood chip mulch, which started as just the gap in between the planting. And now that the plants are kind of in more of a self-mulching mode, we just maintain with some new wood chips that we get for free through a local program every once in a while on those pathways. That's definitely the least expensive way to go, but it can work quite well if you have access to free mulch. We also have enough of a slope in our backyard that something like decomposed granite would not work well over time because it would erode. So the wood chips work very well for us. So here's just a very informal example, broken concrete stepping stones in mulch in this young garden starting to grow in. Here is an example of wood chip mulch with stone and branches to kind of help define the path and the planting versus pathway areas as those plants grow in. Here's an example of just stepping stones that you can get from a hardware store. You can also use flagstone or pavers within wood chip mulch as the path. So the functionality of this is not going to be that different than the wood chip mulch. However, it really does draw the eye down that path and creates a little bit more of a sense of a formal path. It's a mixture of flagstone and decomposed granite. Or here an example of, for the main front walkway up to the door, working with mortared flagstone, but then for the side paths, working with the permeable decomposed granite. So you can kind of mix and match your techniques. It's sometimes nice to have a truly paved path for your main access way if it's constant traffic to and from the door. You don't need to ever worry, for example, in this example, you're not going to ever need to worry about the sands or the flagstone becoming unset and maybe a corner that's going to catch someone walking to the front door, but things can be a little bit more relaxed for that much lower traffic side path. If you are thinking about your street side plantings, remember that car doors will need to swing open and people will need to get out of car doors on the landscape side of the curb. And so that's key to access. So a very typical thing to do is exactly what you see here, where there can be a planting on one side and then a walk-off area, which could just be an area of wood chip mulch that's not planted. Here, which I think is often a good way to go, is a little bit more than a foot width of decomposed granite, which creates a nice pathway that people could exit their cars, have room for the car doors to open. And if you have a higher traffic space where people are going to be getting out and coming to your door, you might also leave a gap in the planting every so often and have the path tee and extend over to the sidewalk. This is along the side of this corner house, and so that access isn't as much of a priority, really just making sure people can get out and then can walk down to the corner. And then also remember, if you're thinking about access, sometimes people have access that's already built into a property. So this fully paved side yard between the garage and the house is an example. And if those areas seem a little too bare, especially in the context of you completing the rest of your wonderful work in your front yard or backyard, remember that pots are something that you can always work with to enhance fully paved areas where there's not room or opportunity for traditional in-ground plantings. And there's plenty of water-wise and California native plants for all sorts of conditions, from full sun to full shade, that will work well in pots and be low maintenance. And so, having discussed our people spaces, or reviewed our people spaces, our paths and access, we're also going to briefly review water spaces and rainwater capture. We've talked about this some, so I'm not going to go into it too much more, but remember, you're going to be thinking about how to turn the water that falls on your property into the best opportunity to use it as a resource. And remember that it starts generally with your roof and your driveway, and kind of reflecting on the site analysis, thinking about where that water either naturally wants to go or can go, figuring out where you can best capture some of that. And if it's a ton of it, you don't need to capture all of it in every storm event, but doing your best to hold on to some of it, and then carefully guide and let go what you can't hold on to. And so you're going to be thinking again about your dry stream beds, your French drain options, and your paving options to allow as much of that water to soak in as it falls on the property, and not necessarily create any more opportunities for water to pool off somewhere that you need to deal with elsewhere. And then a quick recommendation is, if you are going to be working with stone in those features, remember it's going to be best generally to work with the natural stone from where you are in your region. So here in most of Southern California, that's going to be a kind of river rock or granite, and that is going to be not only much less expensive than most of the other alternatives, it's also going to be the main kind of stone that you can easily obtain in multiple sizes, from different sizes of gravel to cobblestones to boulders. And so you can put together a really nice natural looking project where your dry stream bed, if you're putting one in, or your infiltration basin, can also match any other rock work that you do in your garden. And sometimes, depending on the area that you are in, you might be able to get enough stone just out of your yard, or your neighbors might have some that they'd be happy to get rid of. For more on this, remember to check out our Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes workshop on our YouTube page at the link you can see on the screen. And so finally, we've talked in this video about landscape design and planting design concepts. We've reviewed our people spaces, our water spaces, our connection spaces, and now we're going to talk about plant spaces. And the reason why we're talking about plant spaces relatively late is not because plants are unimportant. Plants are extremely important for achieving our goals in the garden. They set the tone for your space. They provide so much of the visual beauty, and they provide the vast majority of the additional environmental benefits to our landscapes. However, for a lot of people, looking at a whole front yard or a whole backyard is very intimidating when you think, what should I plant? Or even if you have your plant list, what you should put where. But by thinking through where your people spaces are going to be, where your pathway spaces are going to be, where the areas that are going to make sense to capture rainwater from your roof or your driveway are going to be. And oftentimes those rainwater capture spaces kind of only make sense to be in one or two spaces. Once you figure out all of those priorities, what's going to happen is that your yard starts naturally to be subdivided into some smaller spaces. And then it's easier to see, okay, I have room for one small tree here that I want to cast shade on the west side of my patio in the afternoon. And then around that, I have room for maybe 2 or 3 shrubs and then some smaller perennials or ground covers. And in another area, that's going to be my one area where I can have one big, large shade tree. Maybe I can fit an oak tree there. Or maybe you decide that you really want an oak tree, so that's going to be mostly your whole front yard over time. That's fine. But by thinking through and subdividing some of these other areas, our planting spaces become a little bit smaller. And sometimes that's a more accessible way to take things on, and then also make sure our plants are really going to be well adapted for what we need to have going on around there. And it doesn't need to be quite that linear. Sometimes you'll think, okay, I want this tree here, so maybe my pathway will shift a little bit from my initial idea. It's one of the great things about working with tracing paper, like I mentioned earlier, is you can have multiple versions as you do those refinements. But in general, that's going to be a very functional way of thinking things through. And we will go through that whole process when we do our final planting design video together, and I will show you what I mean each step of the way. So here's another example. We looked at this picture already when we were talking about planting density, but in terms of thinking about priorities, pathways, and then going from there, I think this is a really lovely example where we have the main walkway, we have the side pathway that creates the space for the larger trees kind of around the edge of the property or the edge of the yard, and then eventually fills in with the small shrubs a little bit farther back, 1 or 2 on the corner as accents, and then ground covers that all match the planting theme in the rest of the space, plus the rock. So it becomes a very logical way of thinking through a planting design. Another example that I quite like, where again, we have our major permanent access to the house, and then we have our side pathway, our water harvesting feature. You can kind of see some of it in the little bit of the background on the left, but it's mostly off to the left. And then that creates this planting bed of an already kind of defined width, just based on where all the paths and access and water features want to be. And so in that planting bed, then there's room for one. This is a western redbud, which is still growing in, but it's going to be a large shrub that can be pruned up as a small tree. Same thing, there's a toyon in the background where that same thing can happen. So the larger accent plants, and then it's room for some foundation shrubs that are growing in at the base of the structure, and then some small perennials further front, closer to the edge of the path and walkway. So it becomes very logical. Also thinking about in your planting spaces how you want to frame the views from inside the house. And so here, the homeowner obviously decided that they want to shelter the house some, and then out of this large window, it creates a view out into the garden, but it's slightly framed by the shrub. And over time, that can be maintained to have things as open or as secluded as they want to feel from inside that window. And then, just like we talked about, kind of building that logic, there's the one large shrub, small tree. Again, it's a toyon. It's one of the most adaptable plants for being that large shrub, small tree, and can take pruning into more of a tree or stay more as a large shrub. So that's kind of the background off to the side of the window, but allowed to grow to obscure it some. And then that sets up for layering. So some manzanitas in front of it that are going to be mid-sized shrubs, and then smaller perennials along the main path up to the front door. And remember that our water capture spaces are also areas that can frame and enhance our plantings. And oftentimes we're going to work with them kind of in the same way with our plantings as we do with pathways, where the larger shrubs can be a little bit farther back. Our medium-sized shrubs can grow over them a little bit, but you're going to want to leave enough space that you can gracefully prune and kind of control that so that our dry stream beds don't get totally clogged up. It's okay if some branches are over them. And then filling in around the rocks with smaller plants like this red buckwheat here. So this is, I think, a very lovely naturalistic way that it can grow in. And then this concept of transition spaces is also relevant to planting areas as well. So thinking through how you want to transition from your access spaces, in this case, driveway, into your planting spaces. And so sometimes having a little bit of an ornamental and functional transition works really well. One of the challenges with a wood chip mulched or kind of natural type mulch in a planting space is that sometimes it's hard to hold it back away from paved spaces. And it does look a little sloppy over time if that wood chip mulch is always falling onto the sidewalk or onto the driveway. And so working with small cobble or small boulders and just river rock is a really nice way to make that transition, which also holds back a few inches of mulch quite well as well and looks really nice to define the edge of a space. And so you can see that in the example here. Or also, this is on the same property, even just a really nice way to treat what's a secondary side space. So I really love this permeable side path of really nicely installed flagstone with decomposed granite in between. And then you can see how they also worked with stone here and had that be the transition into the naturally mulched garden space. And you can see that the garden space is mounded up just a little bit. So probably what happened is that they had to dig out some soil when they were setting up to install this flagstone path. And with that extra soil, they mounded it to create extra areas of good drainage and add a little bit more height into the planters, and then use that rock to kind of hold things back and have the transition be really nice and kind of very graceful while being able to hold the mulch back off the pathway. So we're going to talk just a little bit about mulch as we go before we proceed. Just as a reminder, I'm going to go through this quickly because we talked about it in depth earlier, but if it's been a little while since you've watched those earlier videos, then this is going to help you as we're going into our final detailed design. Remember, mulch is really just a word that means something covering and shading the soil. It should match what the plants want and the look you want. So if you have a woodland style planting, wood chips. Also for fruit trees, things that like rich soil. So if you are still going to have some roses or other general higher water use plants, in general, wood chips. Gravel, decomposed granite, or rock can work well for dry land California natives or desert plants, southwestern plants, or you can work with a combination of gravel, wood chips, rock, and even in some separate areas, decomposed granite, creatively working with them in your yard. If needed, even if you're working with desert plants or dryland California native plants, a quote one and done approach to wood chip mulch, where just to get things established, the soil shaded to prevent some weed seeds, fewer than you would have otherwise, from germinating, you can put down a couple inches of wood chip mulch and then let plants grow in. Some of the plants are going to start self-mulching after a year or two. And then other areas, if you want to come back later and add in some gravel or change the mulch, you can. But oftentimes that wood chip mulch can be easily and sometimes freely available and is a good way to just get the garden going. For much, much more, very deep dive into mulch and lots of pictures, check out our Compost and Mulch for Water-Wise Gardens online workshop recording. And also in the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, we have a whole page talking about mulch details, which really gets into it as well. And the easiest way to find that on the Inland Valley Garden Planner is just to type mulch into the search box and it will pull that up. So wood chip mulch in a young California native planting. Remember, eventually the natural leaf litter can help you grow your own. And then over time, this is an example from my yard, you can consider mixing in some rock and wood for a real natural look, if that's what you're into. It's an example of gravel and decomposed granite mulch done really well, mixing different sizes of gravel and then having a separate area of decomposed granite with some small boulders and rock mixed in. Absolutely lovely. Here's decomposed granite mulch as the primary mulch with just a few boulders here and there, partially buried into the ground. That's always the best thing to do if you're looking for a tip to make working with larger rock look a little bit more natural, is bury those rocks about a third down into the ground or mulch, or even halfway down, and that's going to help everything look a lot more natural than just laying those rocks right on the surface. And that's always something that you can work on over time. I think this is a really lovely area as you walk into the Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano. That is a really nice example of just perfectly achieving a natural ground cover mulch look, where it's a mixture of the leaves and just kind of leaf litter from plants and some stone and some open areas. and then living ground cover. And so to start to wrap up, this is a good reminder that planting design is just one part of design for our yards. And that's why we're talking about it so kind of relatively late in the process of the whole idea of thinking about design. Planting design comes best at the end, after you've already thought about your goals, after you've done your site analysis, you understand your drainage and your sun, you think about the opportunities and constraints of your site. And then when you get to putting your plants together, we've talked a lot about color and texture and things like that. But to wrap up, here are the most important things. Learn and respect what the plants you want to plant need. Group plants with similar needs for water, sunlight, irrigation needs, all of that. That's best summed up as put the right plant in the right place. And the Inland Valley Garden Planner, for the vast majority of plants that the average gardener is likely to be interested in planting in inland Southern California, we have profiles. And for people who are enthusiasts about wanting to get into a little bit rarer or more diverse California native plants, there's also Calscape, which is a great website that has profiles and all that same information about a wider expanse of California native plants than we have on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. On the Inland Valley Garden Planner, we have profiles of over 100 California native plants for home gardeners, and it's some of our kind of most reliable, easiest to grow choices for inland Southern California. But there's definitely other resources on the internet as well that you can use to find all of that information. Water, sunlight, soil drainage, are they adapted to clay soil? Most important stuff. Also really important, remember to look up the mature size of each plant and respect the space that it's going to need, but don't isolate it. We're not talking about one plant here and one plant there in just a sea of wood chip or gravel mulch. And so working out how much space each plant is going to need and how closely to plant the next plant closest to it. It's one of the reasons why having that base map drawn to scale on graph paper is so useful. But even if that is not an accessible approach to you, it's working carefully with a measuring tape out in the yard as you figure out your final planting locations and seeing to the best you can, anticipating how things are going to grow in. Remember some amount of layering though. So for example, if you're going to be planting a tree that's going to be 20 feet wide, remember that that's going to take a number of years. And so you are going to want to put some perennial plants, shrubs, even if they might not be there 10 years from now, in that area, so it's not just bare for many years after you plant. And then remember that it's all a process. So if you plant a whole garden, especially if it's your first time, if you do all of this research, if you go through this process that we're laying out, usually the people I work with find that they're overall pretty successful. However, there's always going to be one or two things that won't work out. And so observe and learn from what works and what doesn't. And that's the key to becoming a successful gardener or just someone who's successful with their plant choices, even if you're not the person who's going to be doing the regular maintenance, is learn from what works and what doesn't. And then don't be afraid to try new things over time. And so with that, this will be the final slide that we will end on, which is just that quick reminder. Sun and shade, soil drainage, irrigation frequency, thinking about the shapes of our plants, and then also the growth rate. And we have that information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, but really that comes down to the most important thing is what we just talked about, remembering that developing shade takes time. Our trees are going to take time to grow in. So with our trees, remember it's going to be full sun around them for quite a number of years at the beginning. And so that's the conclusion of our garden design part 1 video. There was a lot we covered. Don't feel overwhelmed. Even just having these thoughts bouncing around in the back of your head is going to help you when we move towards the final design plan for your yard. So don't be overwhelmed. You don't need to balance all of these factors in your head simultaneously. If you want to create a list out of them and work through that, you can. But just exposing you to those ideas was really my goal in this video. And so with that, we are going to turn to something that's going to be much less overwhelming in our next video, Garden Design 2, Finding Inspiration and Fun Research. We're going to look at the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, and we'll talk about a couple of other online resources. So now with everything that we have presented to you in all of these videos, pulling it all together and moving to the next step, you can really now put your garden designer glasses on as you look at the resources that we have for you online, as you look at other landscapes maybe that you've seen in your neighborhood or in the region that you like, and you can start to understand maybe what you like about them, what you might want to emulate, or elements that you might want to copy in your own design plan. And with that, you can start to really pull together what's going to be the most successful design options that will help you meet all of your goals. If that feels very amorphous to you right now or intimidating, we're going to really be getting down to nitty-gritty details of presenting you resources that you can use as a template to copy into your landscape design as we look at our next video, Garden Design 2, Finding Inspiration and Fun Research. So join us for that video, and whether you're feeling really empowered and creative and ready to start creating your own completely custom design plan, or you're wanting to use our resources on the Inland Valley Garden Planner to identify landscape styles that you like and copy them in a way that's going to be appropriate and adapted to your specific site, we're going to have that content for all of you. So I look forward to sharing those resources with you in our next video.